Four times in history, a currency has dominated global trade: the Portuguese real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, the US dollar. Each one believed they were permanent. Three of the four collapsed following the exact same seven-stage cycle. The Portuguese real lasted 80 years. The Dutch guilder lasted 80 years. The British pound lasted 105 years. The dollar became the world's reserve currency in 1944. That's 81 years ago. And right now, the dollar is in stage 5. Let me show you the 7 stages, how they killed 3 reserve currencies, and where the dollar sits today. But before we understand the stages, you need to understand what kills reserve currencies. It's a trap built into reserve status itself. When your currency becomes the world's reserve, every nation needs it. To supply enough currency for global trade and reserves, you must run deficits. You must send more currency out than comes back in. But running permanent deficits consumes more than you produce, and that eventually destroys the currency. This is the Triffin dilemma. You can't be both the world's reserve currency and maintain a trade surplus. It's mathematically impossible. Now the stages. Stage 1. Military dominance and trade route control. Every reserve currency begins by controlling the pathways that support global commerce. The Dutch in the 1600s perfected this. The Dutch East India Company had its own army and navy, 40 warships and 20,000 soldiers. They conquered trading posts, seized control of the Spice Islands, and dominated the Baltic, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean. If you wanted to trade, you needed guilders, the currency of the power that controlled the seas. The United States achieved the same position after 1945. 11 aircraft carrier battle groups, bases near every critical trade choke point. The dollar dominates because American military power controls global commerce. Stage 2. Massive trade surplus. Once you control trade, wealth flows toward you. Portugal in the 1500s ran enormous surpluses. They bought spices, silk, and porcelain from Asia using gold and silver. But they sold European goods, weapons, textiles, African slaves at massive markups. The balance flowed toward Lisbon. Portuguese ships returned heavy with Asian goods that sold for 10 times what they cost. This surplus built Lisbon into one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. Britain in the 1800s ran the largest trade surplus in history at the time. They exported manufactured goods to the world. Textiles, steel, machinery, ships. They imported raw materials at prices set by British buyers. The surplus built Britain into the wealthiest nation on earth. London's financial district handled more capital than the rest of Europe combined. America had its most dramatic surplus from 1945 to 1970, the only major industrial power with intact infrastructure after the war. America exported machinery, automobiles, steel, consumer goods to the world. Dollars flooded into foreign central banks. U.S. gold reserves swelled to over 20,000 tons by the 1950s, more than the rest of the world combined. Stage 3. Reserve currency status formalized. This is the peak. For the Dutch, it happened in the mid-1600s. The guilder became the currency of choice for international contracts. Bills of exchange were written in guilders. Even the British East India Company used guilders because Amsterdam's financial markets were the most liquid in the world. For the United States, it happened at Bretton Woods in 1944. 44 nations formally agreed. The dollar would be the world's reserve currency. Other currencies would peg to the dollar. The dollar would peg to gold. But here's what nobody tells you. This is as good as it gets. Once you're the reserve currency, the world needs your currency more than your goods. Eventually you stop producing, you start importing, the surplus reverses, and the deficit becomes permanent. Stage 4. Deficit spending and living beyond your means. Portugal saw this in the mid-1500s. The trade surplus disappeared. Instead of exporting goods, Portugal was importing everything. Grain from Sicily, textiles from Flanders, manufactured goods from across Europe. But they weren't producing wealth anymore. They were consuming accumulated wealth. The Portuguese crown spending exploded. Palaces, churches, the royal court. The money kept flowing as long as colonial gold kept arriving. But they weren't building anything productive with it. Britain in the early 1900s faced the same reversal. By 1900, Britain was running trade deficits. They imported food, raw materials, and increasingly manufactured goods. They paid for this with returns on overseas investments. Centuries of accumulated wealth invested across the empire. The investment income was enormous, but it was extracting wealth created elsewhere, not creating new wealth at home. British manufacturing declined. The trade deficit grew every year. The United States entered Stage 4 in 1971, coinciding with the U.S. going off the gold standard and the collapse of Bretton Woods. The trade surplus permanently reversed. By the 2000s, the U.S. was running $800 billion annual trade deficits. We import far more than we export. Consumer goods, electronics, automobiles, everything from abroad. We pay for this by exporting dollars. This works only because the dollar is the reserve currency, but we're consuming more than we produce. Stage 5. Currency debasement and money printing. When deficits become unsustainable, you print money. Portugal did this in the 1550s. Facing deficits and declining trade revenues, the Portuguese crown began debasing the real. They reduced silver content in coins, issued more currency than they had metal to back it. Prices rose. Merchants began refusing reals or demanding more of them. The currency's purchasing power eroded. The Dutch did this in the 1700s. The guilder had been backed by conservative monetary policy. But by the mid-1700s, the Dutch government was borrowing heavily to finance wars and colonial expenses. When borrowing became too expensive, they began printing money to cover deficits. The guilder's value declined. By the 1780s, it was no longer the preferred currency for international trade. Britain debased the pound through 2 world wars. World War I forced Britain to print money and abandon gold temporarily. World War II forced them off gold permanently. Britain printed money to rebuild. The pound devalued repeatedly. In 1949, then 1967, each devaluation eroded international confidence. The United States entered Stage 5 in 2008. The financial crisis forced quantitative easing. $3.5 trillion created from 2008 to 2014. Then COVID, $7 trillion more from 2020 to 2022. This is currency debasement through expanding fiat supply. The dollar has lost roughly 25% of its purchasing power since 2020. We are in Stage 5 now. Stage 6. Loss of confidence and search for alternatives. This is when the world starts looking for exits. Portugal lost confidence in the 1570s. International merchants began demanding payment in Spanish silver instead of reals. Trade contracts denominated in other currencies. By 1580, the real was functionally dead as a reserve currency. The Dutch guilder lost confidence through the 1700s. French, British, and other European powers began holding reserves in other currencies. By the 1780s, Amsterdam was no longer the financial center of Europe. London had taken that position. The guilder was still used regionally, but not for major international transactions. The shift was gradual, but irreversible. Britain lost confidence rapidly after World War II. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound by 30%. International holders lost almost a third of their value overnight. Confidence collapsed. Nations shifted reserves from pounds to dollars. By 1960, the pound's share of global reserves had fallen from over 60% to less than 20%. The transition was complete within 15 years. The US dollar is in early Stage 6 now. China and Russia began reducing dollar reserves over the last 10 years, buying gold instead. Russia liquidated nearly all its US Treasury holdings. Saudi Arabia, which has priced oil in dollars since 1974, began accepting yuan for Chinese oil sales in 2023. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 72% in 2000 to 58% in 2024. 14 percentage points representing trillions shifted out of dollar assets. Stage 7. Replacement and collapse. This is when a new currency rises. The Portuguese real was replaced by Spanish silver in the late 1500s. Spain had conquered vast silver mines in the Americas. Spanish silver coins became the preferred currency because they were abundant and backed by ongoing production. The real couldn't compete. By 1600, it was irrelevant. The Dutch guilder was replaced by the British pound in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Britain's Industrial Revolution and naval dominance made the pound the obvious successor. London's financial markets became deeper than Amsterdam's. The transition took about 30 years. By 1815, the pound was the undisputed global standard. The British pound was replaced by the dollar from 1945 to 1960. Britain was bankrupt after World War II. The US held most of the world's gold and had the only intact industrial base. The pound collapsed in devaluations. By 1967, the dollar had fully replaced it. So what replaces the dollar? We're not at stage 7 yet. We're in stage 5, entering stage 6. The most likely scenario is a messy transition, several regional currencies, the dollar in the Americas, the euro in Europe, the yuan in Asia, gold for settlement between regions. The pattern is clear. 7 stages, 4 currencies, 80 to 110 years. The dollar is in stage 5. And the mathematics don't care about exceptionalism. They care about deficits, debt, and debasement. If you found this enlightening, subscribe. We publish fresh content weekly to help you understand commerce from a historical perspective and draw parallels to modern finance. Thanks for watching.